Welcome, Rick, to Restitutio. So glad to talk with you today. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Sean, for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
So you emailed me. Your story is a little different. You had grown up as a Unitarian and a biblical Unitarian, believing in just the deity of the Father and that Jesus is a Messiah, human Messiah. And then you decided to take an extended tour into the Trinity and to research it and learn about it. And you really tried to believe in it. Tell me about why you did that. What was going through your head?
Well, just to back up a little bit, Sean, there was a time in my life in my early childhood where I was raised Roman Catholic. Uh, Although I guess for my adult life, yes, I was Unitarian from the time I turned 18. But just to back up a little bit, yes, Roman Catholic. I went through I call them the three C's of the rite of being a Roman Catholic: the confession and the communion and
Communion.
confirmation process,
Mhm.
which that last part, I guess, legitimizes one as a Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
Going through that, I don't remember much about it. Don't remember the testing or whatever. I just know I went through it because that's what good Catholic boys and girls do. So I just went along with it. Recited the creed every week. The Nicene Creed they call the Apostles' Creed. I remember it, a lot of it to this day. It's still in my head. At the time, I didn't know what I was saying. I came to find out later what all that was about. I do recall a time when I was, I don't know, maybe 10 to 12 years old. I was sitting in our grandparents' dining room. We were having a spaghetti dinner, I guess it was, and we did that occasionally. And my grandmother had a picture of Jesus, and I think this is familiar to many people. It's a one where it's assumed he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying to God, looking up with the light shining down from heaven. And I was staring at it rather intently, and I remember my grandmother distinctly saying, or asking me, "You know how that is?" And before I can say anything, she answered the question, "That's God you're looking at."
Yeah.
And in my little mind, I wasn't very expressive then. I was kind of shy and introverted. I was thinking about what she said, and I don't think I expressed it, but I definitely thought it. And the question I asked myself was, well, then who's he praying to? It
And
didn't
how
make sense to
would you
me.
say you were 10 years old when you asked that?
It was around that time, yeah, it was 10 to
Wow.
12. I can't pinpoint the time,
It's a
but
great question.
to me, yeah, yeah, it is. I think it dispels a lot of things, but of course, the two natures takes care of that, I guess. But we'll get to that later. Um, so that's where I was as a young child. When I was 18 years old, I got involved with a Unitarian organization called the Way International, and I was involved with that for many years. So when the question or the idea or concept was posed to me that Jesus Christ is not God, and of course my response was, of course he's not. That whole idea was very foreign to me, even being in a Roman Catholic setting. Well, there's a lot that happened in those 31 years that I was involved with that organization. I don't want to get into all of it now. I was involved with the Way Corps. I was a leader for many years. But for reasons that hit us very personally, profoundly personally, back in 2017, I believe it was, we decided to part ways with the Way International. And but we didn't go anywhere. We just kind of were drifting out in the open, but for a while. And during that time, I felt freer to explore. The constraints were taken off because while you're with them, you don't look anywhere else. Basically, you're supposed to just keep yourself fed with whatever's coming out from their central location. Um, so I felt freer to kind of try different things. I prayed, God sent me something or give me ideas or whatever. I didn't know. I looked at other Unitarian organizations. And the only biggest ones I could find, of course, were Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons. And those are a little bit controlling, I found out. But um, and interestingly enough, during that time, I was in this prayer state where I was desiring to get back and into kind of the mix of things spiritually with the Bible. I was out on a walk in our neighborhood, and I see these two young gentlemen get out of a car, and they have the white button shirt with the black slacks and the tie, and I said, "Oh, here we go." And I shouted out across to them or talked to them, "You guys Latter-day Saints?" And they said, "Yeah, how'd you guess?" So I engaged.
The uniform, man. The uniform.
Yeah. Uh, and I said, "Okay, God, let's try this." So I said, "Okay, let's talk." And we just walked. Usually they knock on the doors and whatever. And that's what they were doing, but they saw me and they thought I was an easy target, I guess. So we proceeded to walk through the neighborhood and we're talking about a lot of things. I'm complimenting them what they're doing. They're young men in their early 20s, maybe, who are doing something for God. And I thank them for that, for getting out. Our culture's going downhill. You're doing something that's beneficial, and I saw
Yeah.
that in what they were doing. And then it came to a point where I was asking them, "Okay, I know we're not here to talk about what I'm talking about. I think you want to talk about what you want to talk about." So that began the introduction into their faith, so to speak. And they invited me to read the Book of Mormon. And I was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." So just a quick story on that. After several visits from them over the next couple of months, I read about a third of the Book of Mormon. And just the strong sense that I got from it was that it was made up. So it was, as we know, but their story is that it came from golden plates from heaven, and the Moroni angel, our messenger from God, gave it to Joseph Smith. But anyway, so we parted ways. Didn't find that it was compelling, although it's a great story. If you know anything about it, it's a fantastic story. If it was true, that would be even better, but it wasn't. So
And that's
so
kind of like their main evangelism strategy that I've noticed is that if you ask them, well, how do you know the Book of Mormon is true? Rather than giving you like a list of reasons, they'll say, well, just read it and God will speak to you.
exactly,
Uh,
they actually, yep.
yeah.
There's a verse towards the end of the book that actually says that. After you read this, it says right there, after you read this, pray with intent, and you'll come to believe that this book is true. So that's their challenge. So it's more of a feeling than something that's based on truth.
Yeah.
Is what it's built on. So after that, but I began to take more of a
Hold
step
on.
back and
One
look at
other
things.
question I had.
Yep.
About how old were you? So you were 18 when you joined the Way, and you were how old when you left the Way?
49.
49.
Mm-hmm.
And so during this period with the Mormons, you're 49 years old, or is this later?
This is probably around,
Like a
I'd have to
couple years
say,
back?
50, going on 51. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a little later. You've been out of the Way for a couple of years, and you've been, you're open, you're looking into things, and now you're encountering the Mormons. So you're doing this as a fully grown man. You're not doing this as sort of like a naive kid. You're kind of established in a lot of your thoughts, which is a different situation than if the Mormons came knocking and you were just like uneducated in a lot of things, right? So how did it develop after you saw that the Book of Mormon just didn't it just seemed like made up?
Moved on from there, took a step back. I don't know at what point exactly, but I began to realize that most of the Christian world, I don't know what percentage it is based in Trinitarian doctrine, no matter what branch of Christianity, whether it's from Catholic or Protestant or Methodist or evangelical Christianity. It's mostly by and large Trinitarian. So I began to ask other questions. Well, surely if it's false doctrine, there must be some people who would be more involved, like in other organizations. But so I began to ask more questions. So how can so many Christians be so wrong on such a huge topic? If it is wrong, what's the catch? Why are they beholden to this doctrine, this theology? And I began to get into a little more. Why is it so popular? How does it work? I started looking at Messianic Jews, Jews for Jesus. Surely they wouldn't be holding to the creed. They have Jewish background. That's blasphemy. but I go on their websites, and that's their statement of beliefs, and they are on board. So there you go. There was a video I watched of a couple of gentlemen. Uh, the website is Behold Israel. And I saw on there was a video, an interview. I bought it for like $10. The title of it was Jesus, Man or God. It's like, oh, maybe this is it. Maybe they have something that's Unitarian. It sounds kind of controversial. And I watched it. There are scholars. It's a kind of popular Messianic Jew. His name is Amir Sarfati, and he interviewed a Dr. Seth Postel, who I guess is somewhat renowned in that world of Messianic Judaism. But the interview was all about the Christophanies from the Old Testament and the proof texts of how Jesus appeared throughout the Old Testament in Genesis and Exodus and onward. But it ended with a capping in Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 13, where, as you know, it says, if we confess Jesus as Lord, and then in verse 13 it says, those who call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And they tied that verse back to Joel 2:32, and then that it's Yahweh. So they used that tie-in to say, when you confess Jesus as Lord, it means you're confessing him as Yahweh. And they were giddy about it. They were like, oh, look what we found.
Like they're the first ones that noticed that, right?
They were very happy to present this research. So that got my attention. I'm like, oh boy, am I in trouble? You know, even the Jews for Jesus and Messianic Jews are cretists. And just a side note there, a short while ago, this last year's 2022 UCA conference, Dr. Jerry presented something on that exact section of scripture on the Romans 10, 9, and 13 recontextualization of Joel 2:32. I have to go back and watch and listen again, but I thought it was very telling, looking at it from a Hebraic lens rather than through the Greek philosophical lens, which is the mistake of the ages, I feel. But so that awareness drove me even further and deeper with more urgency to get a move on this. So that's where I started to purchase books. I don't know if I can show these if there's copyright issues here, but there's Simply Trinity, which I thought I'd start there because it goes back to the basics apparently.
And
Then there's
who wrote that?
This is Matthew Barrett.
Okay.
And then there's this is even a simpler one. This is the Trinity, an introduction by Scott Swain. I guess is an associate of Matthew Barrett. And then this is a more of a scholarly, apparently used for a graduate level students, The Quest for the Trinity. This one was even weirder, but if you don't mind, I'd like to cite some just samples that I prepared out of these books. This is from Simply Trinity. When we talk about the Trinity or simplicity of God, the one who is simple or simply Trinity, we mean something far more intrinsic to the very being of our triune God himself. When we say God acts as one, we assume he is one. Since his very nature or essence is one, he acts as one, not merely cooperating, but performing a single act that accords with the triune God's single will. Yes, there are three persons, but since it is the same divine essence subsisting in each, these three persons always perform the same act. Well, that sounds pretty neat. So this one is from the Trinity, an introduction. There is nothing that the Father is that the Son and the Spirit are not, except for being the Father. There is nothing that the Son is that the Father and the Spirit are not, except for being the Son. And there is nothing that the Spirit is that the Father and the Son are not, except for being the Spirit. So
well, that cleared it all up. There it is.
it's yeah, you look at it, oh wow, that's a neat concept, but is it based in Scripture? And then the quest for the Trinity. This got into a lot of the origins with the Church Fathers. This is from a quote from, I believe, Gregory of Nazianzus. So it says, we have Nazianzus. We have one God because there is a single Godhead. Though there are three objects of belief, they derive from the single whole and have reference to it. They are not sundered in will or divided in power. You cannot find there any of the properties inherent in things divisible. The Godhead exists undivided in things divided. It is as if there were a single intermingling of light which existed in three mutually connected suns, S-U-N-S. So again, wow, that must have come up a lot of brain power to come up with that section of thought. So I took this all in. I tried it on. I tried to make it work in my head. And the point was that I wanted to see if I can trace this back. So I started kind of forward in time, mid 500s or whatever, and worked my way backwards after this point. So I looked up certain works on church fathers, on the Incarnation by Athanasius.
Yeah.
I read a little bit of Origen. Of course, he was, kind of back and forth, I guess. Then I read Justin Martyr, all the works, the Apologies, the dialogue with Trypho, there's other works where he condemns, I guess, Greek mythology as well, up to the martyrdom. And I just want to pull this little excerpt out of the dialogue with Trypho. And this is Justin speaking. And I said, as you wish, Trypho, I shall come to these proofs which you seek in the fitting place. But now you will permit me first to recount the prophecies which I wish to do in order to prove that Christ is called both God and Lord of hosts. So, okay, so there's more there, and it is rich with that all throughout that very long work, that part there, the dialogue with Trypho. It is lots of language. Even there's regard for Plato, I find, in that particular work as well. I think it was said of Justin that he said of Plato, regarded him as most holy Plato. I think I read it in one place. But so a lot of mixing going on at that time. So so we also, as part of this effort, along with me studying these works, these online things that I got for the church fathers, I convinced my family, my wife, that we should attend a church, a regular evangelical church. So we did that, and we dove in full bore. Started attending weekly. I shut off all familiar sources of theology that I was familiar with, come from a Unitarian background. I didn't want to hear any of it. I wanted to give this a full, honest shot. And anytime I went into the church, and of course it's almost weekly, they bring up the Trinity or the deity of Jesus. They have it out front most, if not all, weeks, whether it's in the prayer or whether it's part of the teaching or they insert it. Usually was the head pastor teaching at this church. Also, we started to have a small group in our home with church members because we wanted to make connections.
Oh, wow.
And I wound up being the appointed leader. They were forming new groups, and they did it in a way that was where all the new people met together at the church every Sunday in big meetings. Then you broke down the smaller meetings, and then at the very end, you get to choose who you want to have your group with. So we started meeting in our house, and over the course of time, it was decided they all pointed at me as being the one that should be the leader. So I didn't want to do that. That wasn't my intent. It was just to form relationships with people, make connections. I almost joined the worship team as a drummer. I have a little drumming ability, so I wanted to put that to use, but it didn't quite work out. So I was going all in. I wanted to be part of the show. I even wrote the pastors and said, hey, I have a background as being a minister in some regards. So if there's something I can do for you, help out with stuff, I was on board. I didn't hear back from them, but anyway, so I was putting myself out there.
Let me pause you just for a moment. When you read these quotations earlier from these three 3 books describing and explaining the Trinity. This was during the same period that you were going to the church, or this was before you went to the church?
This was, I believe it was when we had already started going to the church, these books here in particular.
Okay. So having read these books, you found them convincing.
I wasn't making judgment yet on them.
Okay.
I didn't understand a lot of it. I was kind of keeping an open mind about it.
All right. So I was just trying to get like why you were quoting those books. It seemed like you were quoting sections that were confusing. And then you said I was trying to hold it in my head. So I'm just curious, like, as you're going to this church, are you thinking to yourself, I have a worked out theory or model of God that makes sense and is consistent internally, and I'm comfortable with exegesis in light of any text or whatever? Or if you were just sort of like hoping that with time this would all make sense?
I think I was in more of the second category, where I wasn't convinced of the doctrine of the Trinity. I was learning it to see how it works, and if it did indeed make sense biblically, exegetically, then I was willing to believe it, but I wasn't there yet in my mind.
All right, please continue.
Thank you. So part of being a life group leader was the life group leaders met with, or the pastor who was over the life group leaders met with the life group leaders periodically. And I met with him. The initial meeting lasts about an hour, just basically get to know each other. How do you feel? How it's going? Any questions? And at the end of that meeting, I intended to let him know, and I did, my background, that I came from a Unitarian background. I had struggled at the time. I was struggling to understand the deity of Christ, and I told him what I was doing. I was reading books. I was studying church fathers, and the first thing out of his mouth, and I guess this is a common response when one goes to a Trinitarian, especially a pastor, he said, "Well, if Jesus isn't God, and only God can take away sin, then we're still in sin." And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, he was the sacrifice for sin. So he was the end sacrifice to end all sacrifices, the one. So in my mind, I'm thinking, so all the animals in the Old Testament became God? I don't know. That I was still kind of struggling with things like that. That was the first answer. And it was a great meeting. He was not judgy. Maybe some years ago, I would have been kicked out, I don't know, for even doubting the Trinity, but he was very respectful and kind, and endeavored to help me understand things. So I met with him a little further, maybe a month or so after that, and he wanted to meet specifically to talk about theology, as he put it, the topic of the Trinity. So I don't remember much about that meeting. I didn't write a whole lot down, but it was a lot of basic things about Jesus, like the hypostatic union and the two natures, eternal generation.
I can't believe he did
like
that. A lot of times eternal generation is sort of like the uncle nobody talks about, that's
Right.
to his credit, I think is great. I mean, if you're going to believe in the Trinity, I mean, might as well get into eternal generation.
Yes, and I think I saw it somewhere where actually that's in some of Philo's wording, eternal generation, maybe, but which of course predated Christianity. But
yeah.
So the meeting ended, and he told me himself he didn't really fully understand it either.
Right.
He's just going along because that's what the church believes. He said what helps him understand the concept of the Trinity, of God being one and existing in three persons, is that if you think of it like a family is a unit, and a family consists of three persons, a father, a mother, and then a child. That makes a family. So to him, that helps conceptualize and understand the Trinity, but it's really not a one-to-one comparison. And I kind of knew it at that time too, but it helped him understand. So that's how the meeting ended. So it didn't have a whole lot I feel, to contribute to convince me of that. But I carried on. I moved on.
Well, you weren't resistant or combative, right? You were more
No,
trying to find a way to make this work because you were happy at this church.
we liked going. It's a big church, about 500 attendees per service. They had two every Sunday. We liked the teachings because they were very specific, kind of a gut or honesty check. Very strong message to live a life of Christianity, of being a Christ follower. They were pretty serious about it. So I kind of craved that too, in many ways, to correct me and to make sure I'm aligning up with scriptures. But then every time the Trinity was brought up, it's kind of like, I'm still kind of nervous ticking because it was one of those things still so embedded in my mind. And my wife patiently went along with me. And during this whole process, she never budged. She was stalwart on what she knew. She was raised in the way international. And so to her, there was nothing to question. But she kind of allowed me to do this, to sort it out. So yeah, we were happy going there for the most part. So yeah. So yeah, the prayers, they were interesting because sometimes when the pastor's up on stage praying, it would be, you don't know what part of the Trinity they're praying to. They would switch in mid-prayer, it seems. Father, thank you for this and that you came down and died on the cross. And so, yeah. So that part was still a problem for me. But during this time too, I would find myself even defending Trinitarianism at times with my wife. So we got into lively discussions. I was kind of an apologist, trying to understand. I was trying to understand, still giving it a shot. I don't have to understand it all, but if I can see that it went all the way back to the beginning, then I'm open for that. Moving on later, we were on vacation and we were driving somewhere, and my wife's still full aware that I'm on this journey, said, hey, do you want to, while we're driving, listen to a podcast on church history? I was like, okay, you found something, so let's go play it. And it started coming out, and the familiar Restitutio entry music or what came on. I was like, wait, no. And I knew about your podcast. My brother-in-law had introduced me to it a couple years ago. But again, I was shutting off all pro-Unitarian access into my brain. So I said, turn it off. I don't want to hear it yet. Anyways, and this is where it gets interesting. After that, it was sometime after that where I was nearing the end of my search as far as early church history myself, and works that are still out there, which is incredible. And the two left that I was planning to read was First Clement and the Didache. And and First Clement, I'm like reading this, and this is like probably late first century, right? Maybe early second. A direct kind of trainee of the apostles, and I'm reading, and there's nothing there that's calling out Jesus as God or eternal, and as a matter of fact, very separate and very subordinate.
Yes.
42 verses 1 and 2, that the gospel that we received, Clement, and talking to the Corinthians, we received from the apostles, who received it from Jesus Christ, who received it from God. So you can see definitely an order, a cascading order descending from the Father. And then in chapter 58, verse 2, it's the only time that I could find where the triad, in a sense, is mentioned throughout the entire book of 60 or so chapters. It mentions God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit in the same verse, but not in the sense that they're the same. It doesn't even say Father. It says God, Lord Jesus Christ, Holy Spirit. And then the Didache. This was the clincher. Jesus Christ, the servant of God. That's it. There is nothing there in that short work, albeit, but it's still very early work. Jesus Christ has been demoted as the servant of God, in a sense.
We actually
backwards.
find that in the book of Acts as well.
Yes, exactly right.
That
So
same
it's
phrase, that the servant of God. Yeah.
yeah, and so I thought this is good enough for me. I'm done. Uh, so all that noise, reading all these books, going through these early church history writings of the church fathers, it was gone. Silence. I had enough. I was satisfied on my quest. Now it's time to rebuild what I had taken down. And then I was ready. I was ready to look at different sources of Unitarian theology, and that's where I began listening and watching the early church history series. And it was episode 7. Actually, it was episode 487 on Restitutio, but it was actually I
Seven.
watched it from your church's website,
Okay.
um, as it was posted there too. But I was gripped. It was gripping. This was our nightly TV watching. We were doing away with anything else. I was happy and very satisfied to watch these presentations. Um, and what did it for me, and the convincing, all of it was convincing, but what was the very last clincher, I guess, was Philo of Alexandria, the Hellenistic Jew who lived around pre-first, a little post-first century, 20 BC, I think to 40 AD. So he predated Christianity. So he's over there in Egypt, a philosopher trying to bridge um, Greek philosophy, usually Plato, with the Bible.
That was the
And
name of the game in those days. I mean, if you were doing scholarship, that's what you were doing. You were trying to take the leading, if I could call it, scientific view of the world and how the world works, and how the world began, and how to lead the good life, which at that time is Plato. They call it Middle Platonism, and you're trying to work that into your own stories, your own perspective that you're coming from as a Jewish person. That would be the books of Moses, the Old Testament, but especially the Torah. And yeah, he's trying to make that. He's trying to make those two things fit together. That's something.
it is, and I was quite appalled by that this was, like as you're saying, a thing, um, bridging something that's definitely pagan in its origins with the monotheistic Bible. um, it was alarming to me that it seemed he's the one maybe that not coined the phrase, but identified the Logos as the only begotten Son. And then this piece, and I think this was the quote that you had posted on there. Uh, it says that in the same manner, God, being his own light, is perceived by himself alone, nothing and no other being cooperating or assisting him, a being at all able to contribute to pure comprehension of his existence. But these men have arrived at the real truth, who form their ideas of God from God, of light from light. And being a Roman Catholic, anybody who is familiar with the creed, those words are almost verbatim in the creed. And to me, that was like, did they steal that from Philo and put it in the creed? And I just was fascinated by that because did he have a direct influence on those early church fathers? And it begged the question. And to me, that was enough evidence that almost like a smoking gun,
Mm-hmm.
that this is, or one of many, I'm sure. I also thought should Philo be a posthumous contributor to the creed, maybe in a sense. Um, so these are some other thoughts I had. Were Philo's teachings and other Greek philosophical ideas like Gnosticism so prevalent in the late first century that John felt the need to write things like I look at the prologue of the Gospel of John, and calling the Word God, the Logos, and the Word was God, And then in verse later, it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that's the Trinitarian proof text. Here it is, right? So, but I don't think that Philo's logos became flesh.
No.
Maybe. So in a Gnostic thought that heavenly beings, divine beings cannot be flesh, but Jesus was definitely flesh. And I'm thinking this is John's point, taking the concept of the logos, which was so prevalent, and correctly applying it to the gospel message, since they're passing this around anyway. It seemed, it's just a theory of mine, that yes, he was flesh. He became flesh. He is the Word of God. He represents God. But he became flesh. He started at a certain point as Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So it's just kind of an initial thought I had, but and other things. So, but one of the great things I enjoy getting involved with the Unitarian movement is very specific statements like John 17:3, where it says, "You, Father, are the only true God." And I think of that as an epic statement. And I say epic statement. I'm involved. What I do for work, I'm a functional tester, a user representative for helping to build software. It's a term used in the what's called the agile methodology. So an epic statement basically is the overreaching
statement. Can you say that
statement.
again? It kind of broke up a little bit when you said that. It's a term used in the what?
Agile is a methodology that's used in project management for building software, basically. Okay. And to help organize the program and keep it moving, there's what's called an epic statement, basically what the business needs the software to do. So everything has to fit underneath this broad, overreaching epic statement. And I think of John 17:3 as that in regards to Jesus Christ and all things God, that even Jesus said, "You, Father, are the only true God." The Father is God alone. So everything's got to fit underneath that big overarching concept. And so what I'm left with here is the question that I asked myself back in my grandmother's dining room: who's he praying to? Who is he praying to? So I guess to wrap up here, I intend to continue doing things. I know there's other resources out there. I'd like to investigate and dig out kind of this biblical archaeology, remove the layers of sediment that have become the orthodox Christian landscape, and that's what people see. Yeah. But if you peel away the layers, you peel away all these things that have been layered on, have been baked in, that have reached a critical mass. I was listening to a podcast yesterday from Dean Cain, where he went over why is Trinitarian so mainstream. I think it was back in February. But he used that idea of critical mass. It reached critical mass, and it's there. It's not going to go away because it's so prevalent. Yeah. So one has to have a desire and an intent to get in and dig away. And once you see it, it's like pulling back the curtain. It's there. See, it's not. It doesn't exist way back when. When you look at the Bible, I said it before, through the Greek philosophical lens, you're going to find stuff that would fit within that. And I think, as you said, the grid. If you put the grid of the creed over the Bible, you can make it fit. Yeah. However, if you look at it through the Hebraic lens, the customs and the terminology and the figures, and as it was written and as it was understood by the Hebrews who wrote the Bible, then it makes sense. Then these things fall into place. And which one is the true way to look at the Bible? Through a post kind of Greek philosophical backwards, or look at it from how it was written. And I think there's a lot to learn there in that regard. I love what you're doing. I love what the UCA is doing. It's a cause I can get behind. I did walk away from, I believe, what was my calling years ago as a leader in Christianity. and I didn't have anything to fall back on at the time. I didn't know. So I do want to help promote and grow this movement, this alliance, in whatever I can do. I don't know what that would be, but it's a truthful cause that I can get behind and help move forward. So that journey, I think I learned a lot. I think I could use a lot of things that I experienced in my mind, and that I can put to work in a good way that's useful to promote Unitarian. I think we exchanged one of our emails. It was, "You're ready for a Reformation. That it's time for that." And in these days, maybe there's not a castle door to nail the thesis to. We have a gajillion of them in the form of the internet. It's just how can we make the most noise to get attention, to grab people's attention, to see that there's options out there.
Yeah.
In that survey you sent to me, there are people that don't buy it. They're just going because that's what they do.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can get out in front and make some noise.
Absolutely. Let me go back to your quest. You did a really interesting reverse quest, a reverse historical investigation. So you said you started in like 400 AD or so. Is
I
that what you
believe so.
said?
I think, yeah, it was, well, I think Athanasius, I guess, was the
Okay, he's
most
earlier than
else.
that. He's in the middle of the
Okay.
300s. So
Right.
yeah, and you mentioned reading his incarnation book on the incarnation, and I think it's interesting. Like even just reading that, he doesn't sound quite as Trinitarian as he's supposed to. you know, and no, actually, you mentioned Gregory of Nazianzus. He's a little later, so he actually does sound more appropriately Trinitarian by today's standards. But then you get back to Athanasius, and you're like, is he? Like I know he's like really strong on Jesus being God as the Father is God, but like, is he really Trinitarian? Does he talk about person and substance? And does he have the same hypostatic union as later Christians of the 5th century? You can start like asking those questions, even with somebody who like basically becomes the poster child for Trinitarianism in the 4th century. And then you work it back and work it back and work it back. I found that account so fascinating to hear. And what struck me about it, Rick, was that how strange it was. Like, why were you doing church history? Why weren't you just doing exegesis? Why weren't you just looking at interpretations of verses?
Well, I guess I wanted to learn the theology in terms of how it was built, and how it is understood by those today. So I felt reading these books would help me do that, to give it a fair shot,
Yeah,
I guess,
yeah,
and to just not to go from um, a pure exegetical. And I'm not a scholar by any means, but so I kind of rely maybe on scholarly works. So I wanted to see their side of the argument completely.
And were these books, the three you mentioned, were they mostly arguing from just like logic, or did they mention a lot of like historical figures and quotes and that sort of thing?
They did, yes. All
Okay,
of them, I would
so
say.
maybe they kind of like steered you to the direction of like, hey, let's look at church history some more. I don't know. It just seems like a weird thing to do. I would do it too, but like most people wouldn't. So that's what I'm trying to get at.
It was just an idea I had, so I followed it.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Um, I remember just so vividly when I was taking a church history class in my master's program, and the professor was so embarrassed because he's like, I think he was LCMS, although he never said he was Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So like the more conservative branch of Lutherans. Um, maybe he was some sort of Lutheran, but he seemed like a really conservative fellow. And he went through the lecture on the 4th century and like the creeds and the councils, and it was just like he was visibly uncomfortable. And I remember looking at him and being like, yeah, that makes sense. You know, because like he believes that what they arrived at was true and godly. And then he has like the actual historical narrative of the chaos, the backbiting, the politicking, the persecution, you know, and there's a real cognitive dissonance there between, you know, this is this glorious truth that sounds so nice when we say it in church, and like just the insane ungodly behavior that led to produce that creed, you know.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because Christians were persecuted in the first few centuries by the government, but then Christians were persecuted by Christians after that, after Nicaea and Constantine, that the ones who rebelled against the established doctrine were, yeah. So you look at where the truth is and who has the truth, and it's usually those being persecuted, maybe.
So let me ask you about your wife. How did she react when you changed back to believing Unitarianism instead of Trinitarianism?
It was kind of not expected. She was like basically indifferent, maybe. She was like, okay. I mean, she was fine. She was letting me do my thing at that time. She was tolerating my little project. And so when I said I'm ready to go back, and let's call the fellowship coordinators that we were previously attending, we just kind of dropped them for a year, and they're very gracious. We had them over for dinner and said, okay, we're ready to get back to your home. But yeah, she was just kind of went along. Okay, here we're doing the next thing.
Okay, and so what's your situation now? Are you back in the Way International, or are you with a different group, or what's your current situation?
I am not back with Way International. This group is kind of made up of those who had been with the Way International. So that's who we are with. It's loosely controlled. It's not this centralized organization. It's they let the fellowships do what they want, basically. And if you want to go to the website, or they have conferences throughout the year at different locations, then you're free to attend or not. So we kind of like that setup. There's a lot of liberties that are not under control.
Yeah, so you wouldn't want to go back to the more controlling environment, because you know you had come out of that, so you don't want to go back into it. But you do want to have community. So are you able to attend like home church meetings on a regular basis?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, once a week.
Very good. All right. Well, anything else you want to share about your journey? I think it's utterly fascinating to hear somebody like try so hard to believe in the Trinity and not be able to do it.
I did. I really tried, but in the end, I got the thumbs down. So
yeah,
there's nothing really else that I have prepared to share. So I feel like I rehearsed this thing over and over, but I enjoy the time to share these things. Hopefully, I can come up with more findings, or I'm looking forward to getting into more of the podcasts. Not only yours, I listen to others too. The Trinities from Dale Tuggy, the Biblical Unitarian, Dustin Smith. So all those are enjoyable. I'm looking forward to getting into more subjects and building up a knowledge that I feel is necessary to have in this day and time.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thanks for talking with me.
All right. I appreciate it, Sean. Thanks for having me.